Today at the National Press Club, the Treasurer's debate. Josh Frydenberg and Chris Bowen are bringing with them vastly different approaches to tax policy and economic management as they square off ahead of the May 18 election.
It would be irresponsible.
The Treasurer's debate. Today at the National Press Club.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac address. My name is Barbara Lane, I am the club's president, and today we are hosting a Treasurer's debate between Josh Frydenberg and Chris Bowen. We've agreed on some pretty basic rules today around the length of speech and the time allocated for answers, and you'll hear some gongs being rung at particular points to try and wrap people up. If you're following the conversation online today, on Twitter, you'll find us at Press Club, AUST, and you can use the hashtag NPC. Now, before the broadcast started, we tossed a coin to decide who goes first, and Josh Frydenberg won. So, Treasurer, please begin.
Thank you, Sabra, and good to be here with Chris. Over the course of a campaign, you meet many people. But one of the most memorable meetings for me was a visit to the Sydney Children's Hospital in Randwick, where I met a young girl called Stella, 6 years of age, who has severe epilepsy. It was a tearful experience, but also a joyful experience, because I was there to announce that the government is listing the drug Vimpat on the PBS, a drug that will help Stella and 14,000 other young people like her under the age of 14 with severe epilepsy. A drug which would normally cost $5,000, which will now cost just $6.50 for a concessional patient. And it was a reminder that budgets are not just about numbers, they're actually about people. And our budget is our economic plan for not just a year, but for a decade. An economic plan that's based on our values of personal responsibility, reward for effort, encouraging the individual and their enterprise, but also ensuring there's a safety net for those who need it. And our budget is in three parts. The first is the fiscal story, paying back Labor's debt and getting the budget back into surplus for the first time in more than a decade. Now, that wasn't by accident, but it was about bringing targeted spending growth. Our spending growth is the lowest of any government in 50 years, and we've achieved getting more than 1.3 million people into a job, with the lowest proportion of working-age Australians on welfare at any time in 30 years. And so with budget surpluses of $45 billion over the forward estimates and paying back Labor's debt by the end of the decade, this really matters to the Australian people, because today the interest bill is about $18 billion a year, which would be enough money to build 500 new schools every year, or to build a world-leading teaching hospital in every state every year. The second part of our budget was about growing the economy and meeting some of the challenges we face both domestically and internationally. Internationally, the global economy is slowing. There are trade disputes which can impact us here, as well as domestically. We've faced severe drought and flood, which is playing out in our GDP numbers, both in farm GDP as well as in manufacturing. Our plan to grow the economy is based on tax cuts for more than 13 million Australians, ensuring that they'll get up to $1,080 in their pockets for those earning under $126,000 in just 8 weeks' time. And backing small business, extending the instant asset write-off for companies up to $50 million, we're extending it to $30,000. It's already been used by 300,000 small businesses and will be used by many more under our reforms. And 80,000 new apprentices to ensure that our young people today are skilled for tomorrow, and that we can meet some of the shortages in our workforce. And importantly, there's $100 billion on infrastructure. We've taken decisions as governments that previous governments have dodged for over half a century. I'm talking about the second airport for Sydney, I'm talking about the Melbourne Airport rail link. I'm talking about a fast rail between Melbourne and Geelong, which will cut travel times in half. We're all about busting the congestion in our cities and ensuring that we can unlock the potential in our regions. We want people to get to work earlier, but we also want them to get home sooner and safer to be with their family around the dinner table. And those plans to cut taxes, to boost infrastructure spending and to create new apprenticeships is all about growing the economy. But we're also ensuring that there is a social dividend, and that's the third part of our budget. Record spending on schools and hospitals and aged care and childcare and disability support, ensuring the NDIS is fully funded in this budget, which it is, as well as respite for our carers. Because a budget is not a trophy for the shelf, it's about what it does for people. But ladies and gentlemen, we have done all of that. Started to repair the budget with a budget surplus, growing the economy, and ensuring essential services are guaranteed, all without increasing taxes. But Bill Shorten and Chris Bowen can't make the same claim, because they are proposing $387 billion of higher taxes on the Australian people. When you get up in the morning and go to work, they'll tax you. When you put money into super, they'll hit you with extra tax. When you buy an investment property or buy a share, they'll increase the taxes on you. And if you're a family business, they'll increase the taxes there. You see, the Labor Party just wants to redistribute the pie. We want to grow the pie. We want all Australians to earn more and to keep more of what they earn. So that's the clear choice at this election. A coalition which is delivering a strong economy, preparing for the international and domestic economic headwinds, guaranteeing the essential services with record funding for schools and hospitals and aged care and disability support, all without increasing taxes. And the thing you need to know about Bill Shorten and the Labor Party is every time he promises more spending, it's coming at the expense of higher taxes. He'll promise more spending, he'll tax you more, and as a result, he'll weaken the Australian economy, creating fewer jobs and lower wages. That's the choice for the Australian people at the forthcoming election.
Thank you, Josh Frydenberg. Chris Bowen.
The Ngunnawal and Ngambri people cared for this land for thousands of years, and acknowledging their elders past and present, any economic debate should recognise right up front that we have a long way to go in eradicating Indigenous disadvantage in our country, and good economic policy should be put to work to eradicate that disadvantage. I also want to acknowledge the Treasurer. Josh and I obviously have some enormous differences of opinion and policy, but I do recognise what a tough job being Treasurer of Australia is, not only for Josh but for his family, and I put that on record and thank you for your service to our country. Josh is the third Liberal Party Treasury spokesperson I've faced in 3 elections. I've stood at this podium, I've debated Joe Hockey, Scott Morrison and now Josh. Josh will talk of a steady hand on the economy, but the fact of the matter is there has been no steady hand. The fact of the matter is that if the Conservatives are re-elected, there's no guarantee that they won't learn the lessons and change their habits, and that Josh will still be here in 3 years' time to debate again. That is their track record. At the last election, the Liberals at least promised stable government. This time they're not even bothering. By their very actions, by the preference pact with Clive Palmer and Pauline Hanson, they're guaranteeing, if they're re-elected, instability and chaos, with all the wackiness that that involves. All the instability and all the chaos. That's not the action of a party serious about economic stability and leadership. Now, the cost of the chaos of the last 6 years has been very real. Josh likes to trumpet how well the economy's going. He did it again just then. But every time he does so, he underlines how out of touch this government is. The economy isn't working for working people. Wages growth at record lows, penalty rates being cut, 1.1 million Australians underemployed, nearly 1.8 million Australians wanting more work. Households stretching their budgets with household savings rates falling and household debt at record levels. And sluggish economic growth, with the IMF predicting economic growth will fall to just 2.1% this year. And Josh makes much of the budget surplus. It's a predicted surplus, a forecast surplus. It, over the forward estimates, depends on wages growth returning magically and suddenly to higher levels. And a quarter of the next year's budget surplus, almost a quarter, depends on spending less on Australians with a disability. This is a government that spent 6 years fighting amongst themselves, arguing about who should do the Prime Minister's job, not to create more and better jobs. Now, I'm happy to be debating Josh here today, but I make this prediction. We'll spend the next hour, both of us, talking more about Labor policies than Liberal policies, because we come to the table with a lot. Josh comes to the table with not very many at all. No policies because they have no vision. No big picture view of what this country should look like in the generations to come. No framework with which to tackle the challenges and opportunities for our country. Today's Liberal Party knows what it's against. It has very little idea of what it's for. The last 6 years can best be characterised as cuts and chaos. And we're expected to believe the next 3 years would somehow be different should they be re-elected. When they weren't fighting amongst themselves, they were trying to give an $80 billion tax cut to big business. They were trying to put up taxes on working Australians, $44 billion worth through the Medicare levy, in breach of an election commitment, with no mandate at all from the last election. Trying to reduce age pension indexation and make Australians work until they're 70. Cutting funding to schools and hospitals that they'd previously promised solemnly to match. But there is a better way. Bill Short and I and the entire Labor team have spent 6 years not focused on ourselves, but focused on an alternative vision for Australia. A vision which will deliver bigger budget surpluses and important investments in health and education. Now, Josh wants to talk a lot about tax. So do I. The fact of the matter is Australia currently has a two-class tax system. If you're of means, you can afford good accounting advice, you get access to the first-class lounge. You can use deductions and loopholes to minimise your tax so that the tax paid bears little resemblance to the headline rate. But if you're a pay-as-you-go worker with only the basic deductions, it's economy class for you. You have to pay the headline rate. You don't get access to the concessions and loopholes. And yes, we have taken tax reform, which has been in the too hard basket for too long, and put it on the to-do list. We have tackled issues that political parties haven't had the courage to do so before, because that's exactly what we need to do, to fund important investments in health and education and make the tax system fairer. We'll get wages growth going by restoring penalty rates, giving the Fair Work Commission the ability to set a living wage, and encouraging investment through our Australian Investment Guarantee and our New Jobs tax cut announced just yesterday. We will tackle climate change. We'll tackle it in a meaningful way. We'll set the framework for investment in renewable energy to put downward pressure on energy prices. The government has tried and failed on multiple occasions. It's just too hard for them. It's not too hard for us. We'll invest in Australia's future, spending $14 billion on Australia's schools, reversing the cuts to universities, investing in TAFE and vocational education and training. We believe human capital is the key to our future. And we'll have the biggest investment in Medicare since Labor invented it. We believe that if you get the diagnosis we all dread, and the battle for and of your life, the only card you should have to reach for is your Medicare card, not your credit card. When you're facing that battle, you should not have to worry where the money's coming from for the next lot of treatment. We'll provide cost of living relief for nearly 1 million families by boosting the childcare subsidy, providing real relief to those who need it the most. So we do offer a real alternative in this election. We don't believe you can cut your way to prosperity. Our opponents offer just more of the same. They ask to be thanked for tax cuts, which they have to be elected and re-elected again to deliver. Tax cuts of which $77 billion will go to the highest income earners. If Josh disputes that figure, I invite him today to present his own. But that's the figure. As much as he won't answer the question, $77 billion. We'll invest in health and education. We go to this election with ambitious agendas for our country. We want to be the government that Australia deserves, nothing less, with vision, with policies, with alternatives for our country. That's what we offer. We have the team to deliver it, the experience to deliver it, to be the government that Australia deserves and nothing less.
Thank you, Mr Bowen. Labor has been the first opposition since John Hewson's in 1993 to explicitly outline a large package of reform to taxation. We've talked about the dangers of Labor. If Labor wins, will the Liberal Party acknowledge that the party has a mandate to carry out those policies?
Well, the first thing is we're going to win the election, Sabra, so I'm not entertaining anything other than that. But we believe that fundamentally these taxes will weaken the Australian economy, and that's at the heart of this election debate. So take the retirees tax. The retirees tax is based on 2 decades of bipartisanship. The Labor Party took that proposal for cash refunds to the 1998 election, saying that it would help lower income earners and it would help retirees. Over 80% of people who are relying on their cash refunds have a taxable income under $37,000. And pensioners will also be hit by Labor's retirees tax. So Labor, in a desperate cash grab and in a game of class warfare, has made these people, over 1 million of them, who are retirees across the economy and the society, feel like tax cheats. And really, by changing those rules, they are going to hurt the economy, particularly capital formation in our economy and the ability to attract investment in Australian stocks.
Your chance to rebut class warfare. You're making people feel like they're tax cheats.
Well, let's just deal head on with the issue that Josh raises in relation to dividend imputation refundability. Let's just go through what Josh is defending, what the government is defending, the current situation. Being the only country in the world that provides tax refunds to people who haven't paid income tax. Spending $6 billion a year now, growing to $8 billion in the foreseeable future, which is more than we spend on public schools at the Commonwealth level, 3 times what we spend on the Australian Federal Police. That's what Josh is defending. He's also defending an inherent unfairness. If you take the examples, take the example of somebody in the workforce earning around $67,000, paying around $13,000 a year tax, fair enough. But a retiree, through a self-managed super fund, earning $67,000 in dividends, paying no tax, but receiving a tax cheque for $27,000. Now, I don't think that's fair, and I don't think that's okay. And we are seeking a mandate, as you refer to change that. Josh didn't seek a mandate, the Liberal Party didn't seek a mandate when they threw 100,000 people off the age pension or reduced the age pension for 300,000. We have an alternative approach, the courage to seek a mandate.
You're out of time. Michael Rodden.
G'day. Can you hear me? Michael Rodden from the Australian newspaper. Treasurer, thanks for speaking. You say you've got an economic plan for a decade, but after sort of the tax cuts that deal with bracket creep, there's not much on the plan really. So I'm wondering if there's other sort of tax ideas that you're throwing around. You know, everyone says we've got to do something about land tax, broadening or raising the GST, corporate tax cuts for large businesses. Is that something you'd like to revisit if you get into government again? And because that's sort of hard one to rebut to, I'm going to break the rules and ask Chris if he can't. Damn it! All right.
The rules are the rules. So we've got to get through a lot of people.
Well, thanks, Michael. You actually raise a state tax, which is land tax. In terms of federal tax, what we are focused on is the most significant reform since the Howard government. It's not insignificant to abolish a whole tax bracket, something that Chris and the Labor Party oppose. By creating one tax bracket between $45,000 and $200,000, you'll have 9 million taxpayers on it, 70% of all taxpayers. And by doing that, we will tackle bracket creep. Now, the Labor Party is against it, which means that an average income earner could be up to $1,000 worse off under Labor than they are under our tax plan. We're all for lower taxes because ultimately it's the people's money. But there is one tax that Chris would find it very hard to defend, and I think that's the housing tax. Because when Chris came up with the housing tax, the housing prices were actually, the housing market was very different than it was today. Houses were going up. But now housing prices have come down. And we've seen from the international credit rating agencies the concern that they have and the warnings that they have issued about a sharp downturn in the housing market and the impact that that will have on household consumption, because household consumption is about 60% of GDP. And you've seen SQM research say that the Labor Party's policies could put rents up by as much as 22% and see housing prices fall by as much as 16%. So it's come at exactly the wrong time for the housing market. It potentially will have massive impacts on the real economy. And of course, it's just another desperate cash grab from the Labor Party.
You have a chance to respond.
Well, Josh just defended his personal income tax plan, which of course requires the Liberal Party to be re-elected twice. But he didn't reveal how much goes to high-income earners. He was asked 6 times this morning, he wouldn't reveal. Scott Morrison was asked 4 times on Saturday, wouldn't reveal. The answer is $77 billion, and if Josh wants to dispute that, I invite him to. And if the Prime Minister will accept Bill Shorten's request for a debate here on Wednesday night, he should come with an answer as well. If they won't answer the question, the Australian people are entitled to ask why. In relation to negative gearing reform, the IMF, the OECD, the government's own Financial Systems Inquiry, the Grattan Institute, ACOS, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia, the Institute of Company Directors, Sol Eslake, Glenn Stevens, Jeff Kennett, Joe Hockey have all recognised the need for negative gearing reform. Josh might say the housing affordability puzzle's been solved. House prices have fallen on his watch. He seems to argue that house price falls under him are wonderful, under us would be terrible. The government didn't even model the APRA change to regulation. They can't have it both ways. Josh is being entirely hypocritical to argue that any house price falls under him are great, but under the Labor Party would be terrible.
Phil Curry.
Hi, gentlemen. Phil Curry from the Fin Review. Mr Frydenberg, and if you want to respond, Mr Bowen. This time last year, the centrepiece of your economic agenda, you weren't Treasurer, but your government's economic agenda was cutting the corporate tax rate for all companies. Now, we know what happened and where the compromise was reached. Since then, you and the Prime Minister have flatly ruled out revisiting that issue post-election in the next term. You've also announced an income tax cut strategy over the next 7 years, which takes your tax to GDP, you stay under your tax to GDP cap until the end of next decade. Can we deduce from that you have no intention as a coalition of revisiting corporate tax for at least a decade, given your tax to GDP ratio has been achieved by income tax cuts?
Well, we're not planning changes on the large companies, but as you know, we've reduced company tax for smaller companies with a turnover up to $50 million, which I note that the Labor Party voted against 26 times, and only at a last-minute backflip by Bill Shorten did he actually accept. We know that the best thing we can do for businesses across the economy is to ensure that they have workplaces where employers and employees are not pitched against each other. The same cannot be said about the Labor Party. They're proposing and raising the prospect of enterprise bargaining, pattern bargaining, and the impact that that would have across the economy. Alan Joyce, one of the big employers, the CEO of Qantas, has said if that policy would come in, it wouldn't have allowed the start-up of a company like Jetstar, which saw 10,000 employees getting jobs. And he also said policies like that would hurt his 38,000 smaller businesses that Qantas supports. So the Labor Party is bad for business, big and small, with its industrial relations policies, with also its opposition to free trade agreements which we've entered into with some of the major countries in our region, including China, Korea, Japan, and the 11-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership, and more recently Indonesia. And of course, the overall tax cuts that we're introducing to the economy is good for economic activity. The worst thing possible for business is Labor's $387 billion of higher taxes. It's going to stifle economic activity. It's going to mean retirees will have less discretionary money to send. It will send prices of homes down. It will be discouraging to superannuation, and of course it will discourage reward for effort and incentive to work a bit harder.
Before I go to you, was that a clear answer, Phil?
Company tax off the books for a decade.
For a decade?
Well, what I'm saying to you is we have no plans to change the company tax rates. We tried that, and you know what the story is.
Chris Bowen.
Well, Phil's right. I mean, Scott Morrison argued at the last election for $80 billion worth of company tax cuts. We were told they're absolutely essential for our future. The only reason they didn't become the law of the land is because the Labor Party in the Senate would not agree. And we know that if the Liberal Party is re-elected and they have some sort of majority through a coalition of chaos with Clive Palmer and Pauline Hanson in the Senate, they'll be right back there. I mean, no plans is a pretty weak defence for the Treasurer to make. He would not rule out returning to the $80 billion worth of corporate tax cuts. The only reason they're not the law is because they were blocked by the Senate. If they get the opportunity, they will bring them back. In relation to our policy is tax relief conditional on investment, requiring investment, the Australian Investment Guarantee, which will reduce the tax on investment down to about 26%. Only we go to the table with that. Josh can't match that, hasn't matched it. And the new jobs tax cut, saying to employers, we'll work with you if you employ young people or older people, people wanting to return to the workforce, we'll give you a hand. We say we'll work with business to provide tax relief. They want to give away $80 billion conditional on absolutely nothing.
Fiona Willan.
Hello, I'm Fiona Willan from the Nine Network. My question is for Mr Bowen. Now, you've made it clear that you look to Paul Keating for advice. He's called the heads of our security agencies nutters and suggested that they should be cleared out to improve relations with China. Who will you be taking advice from, Paul Keating or our security agencies? And does this reflect the views of the New South Wales right in general?
Well, it was quite the outing for Mr Keating with Andrew Probyn yesterday. I think we could all agree, and it's great to welcome him to the election campaign. I'm sure we'll hear more from him. In relation to, and we certainly hope we do, I'm not sure Josh does. In relation to the specifics, we of course will work very closely with the security agencies, and we'll take advice from a range of agencies, including the Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Attorney General and the security agencies themselves. And we will weigh up that advice in the normal, traditional, respectful, appropriate way. And we will work closely with the agencies, as you would expect us to do, as Bill Shorten would as Prime Minister. I do think more broadly, we as a country need to tackle this issue, to be frank, and to tackle the issue head on. The national security establishment and the economic establishment, and by which I mean business and people interested in economic growth, do need to come together to talk about how we deal with some of the issues in our region. There's too much shouting at each other, I think, in relation to those issues. But to answer your question directly, we will work very closely with the intelligence agencies. We will take their advice and weigh it up in line with the advice from other government agencies to the National Security Committee, as you would expect good government to do.
Can I just pick up on that point? You've just said that they need to work closely. What would you like to see? National security within Treasury? Or?
No, of course not. Of course not. The agencies will remain separate. The point I'm making is that, of course, there are challenges, geopolitical challenges in our region, and of course there are great economic opportunities. We need to bring those together in a discussion about our national strategy to deal with some of these issues in a sensible, calm, methodical way as part of good government.
Josh?
I thought Paul Keating's comments were appalling. I thought they were an insult to the hard-working men and women of our intelligence and security agencies that have done so much to prevent 15 terrorist attacks in Australia since 2014. But if you raise Paul Keating, who is Chris Bowen's mentor, I have to point out that Paul Keating has been very critical of Labor's proposal to increase the marginal rate of tax for the top income earners to 49%. He said that is punitive and too punitive, and he's gone on to say that Labor has lost the ability to speak aspirationally to people and to fashion policies to meet those aspirations. That's Paul Keating's words, Chris Bowen's mentor. He's the economic spokesman for the Labor Party, and Paul Keating has said that Bill Shorten and Chris Bowen have lost the ability to speak aspirationally to Australians. Andrew
Probyn.
Gentlemen, no reflection on you two, but it was a bit more fun with Paul Keating yesterday.
I thought I might choose what time the debate starts and just turn up on the platform.
Yeah. Look, we appear to be in an era of new economic norms, low inflation, low wage growth, where economic growth seems to turn up in higher corporate profits and more jobs, but not necessarily higher wages. With this in mind, could you both pledge to ask Treasury why it seems to have routinely overinflated wage growth in all of its forecasts, and rather than adapt numbers that might be a bit more reflective of this new norm?
Well, we can only go on the best advice of Treasury, and you're right, since 2010, including for Labor budgets, they've had to change their forecast on wages. But Chris has got a three-point plan for lifting wages, $387 billion of high taxes. That's not going to do it. Strong-arming the Fair Work Commission, that is not going to do it. And also ensuring that the taxpayer subsidises childcare workers in the private sector. That's Labor's answer to increasing people's wages. Now, I can tell you that Labor is promising childcare workers a 20% increase over the next 8 years. 20%. Their numbers of $10 billion of taxpayers' money is modelled on 100,000 childcare workers. Well, I've got news for Chris Bowen. There's 193,000 childcare workers. So which childcare workers are going to miss out from your taxpayer subsidy? And I say to Chris, what's going to happen in 8 years' time? Are you just going to remove the government subsidy, the taxpayer subsidy for childcare workers? What's going to happen there? Under Labor, the government will be on the hook for decades to come. This will erode our budget, this will erode the economic performance of this country. That's the reality of this step, where the government under Labor would use taxpayers' money to fund the private sector wages. Now, when Bill Shorten raised this idea, he said, we're going to start with childcare. The next day, when there was a whole lot of criticism of this policy, he said, that's it, it's a one-off. Well, what about people in the aged care space? What about people in disability support services? Chris, when are you going to tell them that you're not going to do anything for your wages? The bottom line is $387 billion of higher wages, of higher taxes, is going to lead to lower wages. It's going to lead to fewer jobs, and it's going to lead to a weaker Australian economy.
Well, Andrew raises some very important points. And it is true that the Liberals have had to downgrade wages growth forecasts in every single budget and economic statement. But let's go to some of the issues that Josh raises, because Josh and the Liberals say they want higher wages, but every time they see an idea to actually deliver it, they're against that idea. When they say they want higher wages, they have not a jot of an idea how to deliver it. Let's go through Labor's plan. Firstly, the living wage. There's a choice for Australia. We face a choice. Do we want a working poor? Do we want people who go to work every day, work their guts out, often in 2 or 3 jobs, working shifts, to remain in poverty? The answer to that, from our point of view, is no. We do not want a working poor, and we will give the Fair Work Commission the ability to determine how to avoid a working poor and give them the right to set a living wage and set the time frame for meeting it in line with employers' capacity to pay. That basically restores the Fair Work Commission to the powers they had pre-John Howard. That's not that radical. It's actually saying, as a country, we won't have a working poor. Secondly, in relation to penalty rates, this is the first direct wages cut for people since the Great Depression. No trade-off, no increase in the base rate, no enterprise bargaining to get to a more productive outcome, just a straight wages cut. Really? After 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth, we as a country have to cut people's wages like that in an arbitrary fashion with no impact on employment, no increase in employment. It's wrong. And finally, early childhood educators. Well, our country and our society relies on these people. We delegate to them our youngest and most vulnerable and ask them to nurture their brains and nurture their growth. And we pay them $25 an hour. Now, with all due respect, they deserve more than that. And Josh just will wipe his hands and say it's all too hard. We could ask childcare centres to pay, fees will go up. Or we can actually say we will tackle this issue and pay our early childhood educators what they deserve.
What about the 2 key points that Josh Frydenberg raised, that you've underestimated the number of workers in the field, 193,000, and also he said, what happens after 8 years? You withdraw the subsidy.
No, well, not everybody who works in the childcare sector broadly is an early childhood educator. This has been carefully designed. It's been costed with the Parliamentary Budget Office. And what's Josh's solution? We're just going to keep paying our early childhood educators less than we pay receptionists and checkout operators? Now, with all due respect to receptionists and checkout operators who work very hard, we can't continue to pay so poorly those with whom we entrust our youngest and those for whom we ask them to nurture their brains for their development. We actually think we've, rightly as a country, lifted their level of qualifications, demanded, required that they lift their level of qualifications, and we've paid them no extra to do so. Now, yes, it's a big call for the government to intervene, but it's the right call. I've allowed you more time. Do you want more time?
Well, the last time the Labor Party did it, indeed not on a $10 billion scale, Sabra, but on a $300 million scale during the Rudd-Gillard years, there was an independent PwC report which said the policy was all about boosting union membership. That's the real story here. Taxpayers across the country having to fork out $10 billion to boost union membership, while aged care workers and disability support workers all miss out. And every time Labor spends a dollar, it's on the back of higher taxes. It's on the back of retirees. It's on the back of your higher rents. It's on the back of your superannuants. It's on the back of income tax earners. It's on the back of family businesses. That's what Labor's proposing, higher taxes.
Sarah Martin.
Sarah Martin from Guardian Australia. Mr Bowen, you have announced $157 billion in tax reform measures to fund your spending priorities. What will you do if, for example, your dividend imputation changes of around $60 billion are not passed through the Senate? Are you prepared to curb your spending measures? And likewise to the Treasurer, if the budget assumptions prove to be overly optimistic, will you scale back your tax cuts?
I was strict on Michael. I'm going to be strict on you.
Same question.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah, we will go, if we do win the election, we will go to the Senate pointing out that we were very upfront with our plans. Unlike the Liberals, who brought down the 2014 budget with all the cuts that it involved without a skerrick of a mandate in clear breach of election promises, we haven't announced most of these things during an election campaign. We've been announcing them for 6 years. And so we will have a mandate. And I don't argue to you that that means the Senate must automatically agree. We'll treat the Senate with respect. But we will point out that that is the essential starting point for the passage of our budget through the Senate. Secondly, I mean, the Liberals went to the last election with $13 billion worth of measures which not only weren't going to be approved by the Senate, had already explicitly been rejected by the Senate. The famous zombie measures which Scott Morrison and I debated on this podium 3 years ago, and they said, no, we'll get them through, and they didn't. So, of course, political parties go to elections with our policies, but in our case we go to the election seeking a mandate to do the things. I mean, I thought the Senate was perfectly within its rights to reject the Liberal budgets, to cut the pension, cut aged care payments, to cut SBS and ABC and all the rest when they had no mandate to do so in 2013. And indeed, in 2016, they did not seek a mandate to increase the Medicare levy, which would have cost workers $44 billion. They didn't promise that at the last election. Scott Morrison tried that as Treasurer. So we've seen the failings of the other side, who did not have the moral authority of their program. We will, if we do win the election, have the moral authority of having sought a mandate to do so.
Well, Sabra, Sarah, we've based our tax cuts on the budget forecast, which have been independently reaffirmed just days after, a week after the budget in PIFO by the Secretaries of Treasury and Finance. And the fundamentals of the Australian economy are good. We've seen unemployment come down to 5%. Let's not forget when Chris was in government, unemployment was at 5.7%. Our biggest state, New South Wales, unemployment's fallen to 4.3%. We've seen investment levels up, particularly in the non-mining sector. So the fundamentals of the Australian economy are sound. It will continue to grow strongly. But let's not forget, when it comes to our tax cuts, not only is Chris Bowen opposing what we announced in this year's budget, he's promising to reverse legislated tax cuts from last year's budget.
How much for high income earners, Josh?
Well, if you're talking about what we announced in the budget, it's very clear. $95 billion to reduce from 32.5 to 30 cents in the dollar for the tax bracket from $45,000 to $200,000. Now, that is obviously going to stop bracket creep. But what is key about what we have done there is what we've focused on is the middle income earners. There's only one person at this podium who is promising to change the top rate of tax, and that's you, promising to increase it to 49%, what Paul Keating calls too punitive.
$77 billion for high income earners, right or wrong?
Well, the Australia Institute is a Labor-leading initiative.
No, are they right or wrong? $77 billion.
The number is $95 billion for 32.5 down to 30 cents in the dollar. You know, Chris, this is a distraction because what the focus in our budget is on ensuring that people who are low and middle income earners are getting the full benefit of our tax cuts. And under our plan, it's very clear that the progressive nature of our tax system is not only maintained, it's strengthened. So when it's fully rolled out, our tax cuts, what you will see is the top 5% of taxpayers, which equates to that top rate of marginal tax that you're referring to, end up paying even more of the overall tax burden, about a third. So, Chris, you can go on about 77 or 95 billion, but you know very well when you put down budgets, or Labor put down budgets when they were last in office, what the Treasury does when it comes to tax is it puts the cost to the budget, and we've said it's 95 billion.
A quick rebuttal, and then we need to move on.
Three things out of this debate, Sabra. Josh cannot confirm the $77 billion figure, and he can't deny it because it happens to be true. Secondly, he has not ruled out returning to the $80 billion worth of company tax cuts if they get a majority in the Senate through their coalition of chaos. And the third point, it's a direct question from Sarah about cuts. His own budget, which he referred to, and PIFO confirmed that to pay for those tax cuts, spending to GDP will come down. That's equivalent to $40 billion a year. The Liberals have form when it comes to cutting health and education, and they are baking in high-income tax cuts, and they will have to be paid for eventually by cuts to health and education if the Liberals win.
Sabra, just because this is the start of his scare campaign, I can confirm we're not coming back to the company tax cut. So there you go.
David Spears.
David Spears from Sky News. Amidst all the spending promises from both sides, there's been no firm commitment to do anything about the New Start. I know Labor's suggested you look at it, but I'm just wondering why you haven't been able to make a firm commitment on that, nor the government. Why don't they deserve more at this election?
Well, I can make a couple of points. The first is 99% of people on New Start are actually on another type of benefit. Might be a parental allowance or another form of support, and that's really important. The other thing about New Start is 2/3 of the people come off within 12 months and go into a job, and we've really been successful in helping to create the conditions where 1.3 million people have found more jobs, including a majority of women, and over the last year 9 out of 10 new jobs that have been created have been full-time, and that's really significant. But David, because you raised the issue of New Start, I think it's important that Chris answers the question, because Bill Shorten has said during this campaign that New Start needs to rise. Now, the Labor Party are putting out their costings this week, and Bill Shorten said in the most recent debate that his costings will, quote, be the full box and dice. That's Bill Shorten's word, the full box and dice. Will they include the extra spend on changing New Start, which Bill Shorten says has to happen, or again, will your costings dodge that real question? Also, you've had Penny Wong say during this campaign that you have to lift spending on aid. Will your costings include the additional spending on aid? You've also had Kim Carr say that you want to increase spending on research and development. Now, if Kim Carr is saying that as a minister, a shadow minister, will your costings include extra spending on research and development to get to his goal? These are the questions, Chris, that you have to answer to the Australian people, because over 500,000 people have already voted. They don't know the true cost of your climate policy and the impact on the economy. You've dodged that question, and your leaders dodged that question now 68 times. Please don't dodge this question about New Start, research and development and aid.
You'll have 2 minutes, Chris.
I wouldn't be raising dodging questions, Josh, after refusing to confirm $77 billion of high income tax cuts. But on the question of New Start, there's a choice really here, to be frank and briefly, between the two sides. One side says no issue, no problem, nothing to consider, nothing to look at. Won't change. Our view is there are legitimate issues that do deserve thorough review. Now, I understand some people just argue we should make a firm commitment to increase New Start. We won't be doing that. We're not doing that. But we are recognising there are issues which need the resources of a proper government review going forward to examine, which is our commitment. In relation to costings, we will be releasing our costings this week. That will be the earliest any opposition has released its costings in 30 years. The Liberals released their costings on the Thursday before polling day in 2013. 2 days before the election. We're releasing them this week, which will be the earliest of any opposition in 30 years. Why? Because we have a good story to tell. We've done the hard work in relation to policy, and of course the Liberals, while they released their costings late in 2013, they actually released their policies in 2014 in the budget to cut the pension, to cut the ABC, to cut the SBS, all things they lied about. And of course at the last election they promised no increase in tax and then tried $44 billion worth of increase in the Medicare levy. Of course our costings will reflect our commitments on research and development and foreign aid.
Just picking up on the point of the review, though, are you raising the issue of false hope with people on New Start?
Look, Sabra, I think we're just being honest with people to say, unlike the Liberals who say nothing to see here, we think New Start is fine. We think there are genuine issues. We agree with the Business Council of Australia. Won't hear me say that all the time, but on this issue, I think John Howard himself has said that New Start is worthy of consideration. But we're not going to just make a commitment. It is a complicated issue in relation to how New Start relates to other government payments. I accept the point that Josh makes there, how it relates to the living wage, minimum wage, etc. These are issues which we will work through sensibly as a government.
Shane Wright.
Shane Wright from The Age and the SMH. Gentlemen, the Reserve Bank, according to financial markets, is at shorter odds than Winks to win than to cut rates sometime over the next 3 months, which may be tomorrow. What is that saying about the state of the Australian economy? Mr Frydenberg, you mentioned that the economy may be slowing, we've got drought, you've got trade wars going on. Is it the right time, gentlemen, to start running substantial surpluses when the Reserve Bank is considering a loosening of monetary policy?
Well, I can say, Shane, when the most recent inflation numbers came out, they showed that childcare expenses had fallen by 9%. They showed that electricity prices had come back. And I know when you talk about interest rates, Chris Bowen had said when he was up against Joe Hockey that lower interest rates were good for the economy. So these are decisions that are ones for the Independent Reserve Bank. We know that the cash rate has stayed where it has been since mid-2016, so it's been there for some time. But again, monetary policy, these decisions are matters for the Reserve Bank of Australia. I wouldn't seek to preempt in any way those decisions that may or may not be taken, other than to say the fundamentals of the Australian economy are sound. We're growing at 2.3% in relation to the most recent national accounts. That's faster than any G7 nation except the United States. But we are facing some headwinds domestically and internationally. That's why this is not a time to risk the Labor Party, who can't manage money, who are proposing $387 billion of higher taxes on retirees, higher taxes on homeowners, higher taxes on renters, higher taxes on people who want to put additional money, including women after raising a child, into their superannuation as a catch-up contribution, higher taxes on family business. The Labor Party, doesn't matter what the question is, the answer is higher taxes.
Well, neither a responsible Treasurer or Shadow Treasurer would preempt the Reserve Bank movement. That is true. But the fact that we're even having this conversation, even contemplating that interest rates, which are at what would still widely be regarded as very low levels, and indeed almost emergency levels, could be reduced further. I think it shows the real concern about the economy under this government's watch. Growth slowing. The forecast downgraded in the budget. Wages growth anaemic. Consumption growth at its lowest rate in 6 years. I mean, the fact that the Reserve Bank would be contemplating this, with inflation at zero, showing that there are real problems in the economy, means that the government's claim to be the better economic managers lie in tatters. Now, of course, any relief for borrowers is welcome, but it's what the Reserve Bank is thinking about the economy which is the telltale sign that Josh claims the fundamentals are sound. Well, not only is the economy not working for working people, it is not growing as strongly as it should. It's growing well below potential, well below trend historically, and we can do better. We can do better with an investment guarantee, a new jobs tax cut, important investments in infrastructure, health and education, which would actually be good for the economy, as well as our bigger tax cuts for those who earn less than $48,000.
Though, Shane, did they answer your question about substantial surpluses?
Well, sure. Well, perhaps I will. Perhaps, and then Josh can.
Yeah.
Actually, it's a time for bigger buffers. Actually, it's a time for the government to have more levers at its disposal. Now, this election, I say to you, is unusual in that the Labor Party, when we do announce our costings, will show bigger budget surpluses than the Liberals. Now, I do accept that that is unusual historically, but we do so deliberately because we think that with interest rates low, with wages growth so anaemic, with household debt at international record levels, we do need bigger buffers. We need a bigger insurance policy against uncertain international economic times through bigger budget surpluses.
Don't look at what Labor say, look at what Labor does. The last time they delivered a budget surplus was 1989 and the Berlin Wall was still standing. Wayne Swan promised 4 budget surpluses that never eventuated. They were based on heroic assumptions, including $175 iron ore price. Only the Coalition can deliver budget surpluses, as we have set out in this year's budget. And the Labor Party, bizarrely, is talking about imposing a deficit levy on the one hand, and on the other hand talking about budget surpluses. Go figure.
Colin Brinsden.
Colin Brinsden for IAP. This is my questions to the Treasurer, but I'm sure Chris will want to have a go as well. I was taken by a Liberal advert the other day, not in a good way, I hasten to add. It was about this elderly couple who were fearing about their franking credit refunds being taken away. And the guy says, I may have to go on the pension. And I thought, should you be embarrassed about that? Now, I know you didn't create the advert, but is that what the Liberal Party thinks? It's a bit of an embarrassment to go on the pension? I mean, to use your own argument about keeping franking credits, these people work all their lives and pay taxes. Surely, you know, if you need the pension, you need the pension, full stop.
I totally understand why some people need to go on the pension. But I also understand that a lot of people are self-funded retirees, and these are the people that the Labor Party is targeting. I mean, when it comes to the retirees tax, you have to ask the question, why has the Labor Party conveniently excluded unions and union-backed industry funds from being affected by the retirees tax, but they're coming after more than 1 million retirees, including many self-funded retirees? I mean, there's a natural inconsistency in the Labor Party's position. The fact is, a lot of people rely on these cash refunds in order to maintain their way of life, and some people will be pushed onto the pension. Now, when people go onto the pension, obviously the government needs to fund that, so that's going to be an additional cost to the public purse. But the Labor Party have also not been absolutely upfront with the Australian people how their retirees tax will affect pensioners. People who were on a self-managed super fund before a certain date in March last year and then become a pensioner after that date will be affected. And people who were a pensioner before that date in March last year and get a self-managed super fund after that date will actually be affected. So some 50,000 pensioners will be affected, and Bill Shorten was pulled up on this during the most recent Leaders' debate. So it will affect pensioners, it will affect people who will be pushed onto the pension. It ultimately goes against 20 years of bipartisanship on this particular policy. And Chris Bowen, in coming after retirees and making them feel like tax cheats, is engaging in a level of class warfare which is not good for our society and certainly not good for our economy.
Well, I think Colin raises a legitimate question, and I went through before the things that Josh is defending. Being the only country in the world that does this, providing tax refunds to people who haven't paid income tax, the inequities compared to people who are in the pay-as-you-go system, working and receiving a similar income to somebody who's a retired shareholder. And I make this point. I make this point to the retired shareholders. I respect the fact they've worked very hard. I respect the fact they've saved hard. But I also respect the fact that we need to make decisions to ensure the budget is sustainable and fair going forward, and to show them the respect of telling them about our plans before an election. But this is the other thing Josh is defending. This is the other thing Josh is defending. Dividend imputation was introduced by Paul Keating to avoid double taxation. So you weren't taxed on the dividend as well as the company paying tax. By making it refundable, that's not double taxation, that's avoiding any taxation. Now, Josh might want to bring back the $80 billion worth of tax cuts for big business, but I would have thought we could all agree that the corporate tax rate should not be zero. And when you're refunding every dollar of tax paid to the shareholders, the corporate tax rate is zero. Whether it's BHP, Telstra, whatever company, the society gets a tax take of exactly nothing.
Sabra, can I just say, you're making a false analogy between income earners and people who are retirees with shares, because what you're failing to explain is that one is about taxing income and the other is about taxing capital. And what is really concerning about Labor's policy is it's going to dampen aspiration and it's going to make capital formation in this country more difficult. I mean, think about what the Labor Party is proposing, a 50% increase in capital gains tax. See, anyone who goes and buys a share, they're going to pay an extra 50% in tax as a result of the Labor Party. If you're an investor and there are 58,000 teachers who are doing that, you go out and buy a property, Labor is, with their Labor's changes to negative gearing, they're going to make your life much more difficult. And talk about grandfathering, I mean, the fact is there's going to be less investors in the market, so even people who are grandfathered are going to be selling into a market with fewer buyers.
Quick rebuttal.
Well, again, the Treasurer seems to think that property price reductions under him are fantastic, under us would be terrible. But I think it's telling, briefly, that the Liberal Party likes to talk about tax, and they've even gone so low as to make up a Labor tax, to run an outrageous dishonest scare campaign. You go to Liberal advertising column about a death tax. I mean, I'm happy to debate our policies. I'll debate them on multiple occasions. Bill Shorten will debate them here on Wednesday night if Scott Morrison turns up. But tell the truth. Stop making things up and scaring people about a death tax or an inheritance tax, because you know, Josh, it is fundamentally untrue.
Well, there's someone sitting in this audience, Andrew Lee, who's part of your shadow Treasury team who wrote an article, Bring Back the Inheritance Tax. And he said openly that it's an efficient form of tax. Now, we know what Julia Gillard said, that we know carbon tax under a government that she leads, and then we saw a carbon tax. So the reality is the public don't really know what your next step is on tax. You've broken 20 years of bipartisanship on the retirees tax. Negative gearing has been a fundamental part of our tax system for decades. You're breaking that. You, as when you were Treasurer, said you weren't going to increase taxes on super. Within 48 hours of that press release, you increased them by $9 billion. Now it's $34 billion after Bill Shorten looked down the camera and said there'd be no increases in super. At the end of the day, this election, Chris, is about the Labor Party increasing people's taxes and the coalition who are lowering people's taxes.
Well, we've offered tax relief, which is bigger for Australians earning less than $48,000. If you want to talk about election promises, I don't recall you promising to throw 100,000 people off the age pension, Josh. I don't recall you promising to reduce the age pension for 300,000 people, all things that have happened while you've been in government. I don't recall you promising to cut funding to the ABC or SBS, and I don't recall you promising to increase taxes by $44 billion on working Australians by the Medicare levy, which only did not happen because of the Labor Party. So you want to talk about election promises? Let's talk about election promises, because you've broken more than anybody on this podium.
All right, next question. Brett Mason.
Brett Mason from SBS. Treasurer, you started today's debate by saying budgets are about more than numbers, they're about people. Australia's foreign aid has fallen to an all-time low as a proportion of gross national finance. That means that Australia is now one of the least generous countries in the OECD. Given the 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth we hear about and your much hyped projected surplus next financial year, is this domestic retreat a wise financial investment? And perhaps, Treasurer, if you could outline, Shadow Treasurer, if you could outline Labor's policy in terms of foreign aid.
Well, we continue to provide more than $4 billion in foreign aid, and it's a key part of what we need to do to support our neighbours. What we have done is redirected a lot of our foreign aid to our near neighbours. And the money goes to really important causes. Female empowerment, particularly ensuring that they can get the money to start a small business, better education and health services. Infrastructure is critical, particularly transport infrastructure, so that you can move goods from the farm into the marketplace. We are doing a lot of things on a number of fronts through our aid program. We're also ensuring that that money is better spent than it has been in the past.
The Liberal cuts to foreign aid have been extraordinary. I mean, every single budget, I think, there's been cuts to foreign aid. And I think that's mainly because they don't need parliamentary approval to do so. So every time their other cuts have been blocked, they've said, well, development can cop it in the neck because we don't need to get that through Parliament. Now, that can't go on anymore. It's bad as good corporate citizens or international citizens. It's bad for our geopolitical interests. We have become bad citizens in relation to foreign aid. Now, we have made a commitment to increase foreign aid each and every year we're in office. We will increase it as a proportion of GNI. Now, we don't pretend that we can repair all the damage overnight. It will take some time to return 0.5%, and we'll obviously lay that out in full detail. But foreign aid, overseas development assistance, will be better under a Labor government than a Liberal government every single time.
Michael Keating.
Michael Keating from Keating Media. My question is to both gentlemen. Why is neither party proposing to do anything about the high transaction costs of the delivery of government services, which is estimated to cost the budget around $43 billion per year?
Well, we're always seeking to get value for money for the delivery of government services. At the end of the day, we'd hope the private sector can also deliver services as well effectively. But what we won't do is spend money on ill-designed policies like we saw from our political opponents. We all remember the pink bats and the school halls policies and the cash for clunkers. They were totemic policies that were part of the Labor Party's time in government. We've been a lot more focused in how we get money out the door. We will partner with the private sector where it's appropriate to do so, but we're also always looking to streamline and create the most efficient services possible.
I would refer you, Michael, to some of the statements and announcements that have been made by people like Jim Chalmers and Ed Husick, our Shadow Human Services Minister, about how we would tackle some of these issues. We do think some of the issues about digital delivery are very valid but have been botched. by the government, and we've seen some spectacular examples of that. When you look at people like Jim and Ed, they are completely focused on better service delivery at the most efficient way possible. So I do accept the premise of your question that more needs to be done, and we have been considering and announcing initiatives in that space.
Last question today, John Keogh.
Thank you, gentlemen. John Keogh from the Australian Financial Review. My question is to both of you on government spending. Treasurer, your budget essentially assumes that there's no real increase or no increase in new government spending announcements between the next 4 to 10 years, which seems unrealistic. Mr Bowen, you've announced some rather large spending announcements in this campaign that start relatively modest inside the first 4 years but blow out to many billions of dollars over the decade. And your last time in government, Labor did build unsustainable spending into the budget in the medium to long term. Why should voters trust either of you to control government spending?
Well, we inherited spending growth, John, which was around half of what it is now. So it's the lowest of any government in 50 years, but we've been able to do that by targeting our spending in a more effective way. So record funding, a more than 60% boost to hospitals and to school funding, and as I said, aged care, disability support. So spending as a proportion of GDP is around 24.6% today. Now, it will fall by about 23.6% by the end of the decade. I'll put that in perspective for you. I think the Howard government was about 23.1%. But spending is one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is revenue. Now, when you look at tax to GDP, we have been pretty successful in ensuring that stays below our tax to GDP cap. So today, it's 23.3% for 2019-2020. Under Labor, it goes to 25.9%. They will be the highest taxing government in Australia's history. By the end of the decade, 25.9% is the tax to GDP ratio under Labor. Now, that's no surprise with $387 billion of higher taxes. But at the end of the day, it's going to suppress economic activity across the board. You take money from retirees, take money from superannuants, you take money from homeowners, you put up rents, you take money from income earners and family businesses, you are going to suppress economic activity. So the Labor Party is going to increase our tax to GDP ratio to a record amount. And remember, whenever Labor spends more, they tax more. And when they tax more, they weaken the Australian economy.
I do just have to pick the Treasurer up on the mistruth at the end on tax to GDP, and then I'll turn to John's question. I mean, it's just not true, and you're just making it up. And in fact, you released so-called...
What is it at the end of the decade?
You released so-called Treasury modelling, which the Treasury made clear was not their modelling. And in fact, the tax to GDP ratio, you know, Josh, was written in your office. So what is in your office, not by the Treasury.
So what is tax to GDP?
So please be honest.
What is tax to GDP? By the end of the decade?
Tax to GDP will be the same or lower than John Howard during the Ford estimates. And you know it. And if you want to accuse John Howard of being a socialist, go ahead. I don't mind saying that Paul Keating's a friend of mine, but if you want to take John Howard to this podium, that's a matter for you.
By the end of the decade.
And Josh, tax to GDP will be the same or lower than under John Howard under our government. In relation to spending the GDP, with respect, John, the government is not proposing no increase. They're proposing reductions in spending the GDP, which the Grattan Institute has modelled at $40 billion a year. Again, if Josh wants to deny that figure, I invite him to provide the alternative. $40 billion a year worth of cuts to pay for his high income tax cuts, $77 billion going to high income earners. That's in Josh's own budget, confirmed by the PFO.
Right, gentlemen, now I invite you each to give your final 1-minute address. Josh Frydenberg.
The Coalition has an economic plan to grow the economy and to create 1.25 million new jobs over the next 5 years. And we're doing that by cutting taxes for over 13 million Australians, by creating more than 80,000 new apprentices, and by spending $100 billion on infrastructure in order to get you to work earlier and to get you home sooner and safer. We're doing all of that while guaranteeing record funding on essential services of schools and hospitals without increasing your taxes. The Labor Party are only promising one thing, $387 billion of higher taxes. And remember, the more they spend, the more they tax, the more Labor weakens the economy, leading to fewer jobs and lower wages.
Under a short Labor government, the tax system will be fairer, hospitals and schools will be better funded, surpluses will be bigger, and emissions will be lower. Josh and I could agree that there is a real choice at this election. There's only one side in this election which is promising a significant increase in health funding, which is promising to boost Medicare, the biggest investment in its history. That's Labor. There's only one side in this election promising to lift the human capital of the nation, to lift the horizons of the Australian people through education, through a $14 billion investment. That's Labor. There's only one side in this election with a proper plan to increase wages. Not just say we want increased wages, but to actually deliver increased wages. That's Labor. There's only one side of this election proposing $77 billion worth of tax cuts for high-income earners, and that's Liberals. There's only one side which may return to the $80 billion worth of corporate tax cuts they said were absolutely essential for our future. That's our opponents. Our program is clear. Our team is united and stable and talented. We are ready to be the government Australia deserves. We're ready for government.
Everybody, please join me in thanking Josh Frydenberg for his time.
Okay, so our colleague and National Press Club President Sabra Lane moderating a debate there between two gentlemen, one of whom will have their work cut out for them come Sunday, the 19th of May. Either Chris Bowen or Josh Frydenberg will be Treasurer of Australia in what are economically difficult times, and both have a job ahead of them to sell those final messages to voters over the last 2 weeks and then to implement them if one or other is ultimately successful in becoming Treasurer. Now, we're going to cover off with our political editor, Andrew Probert, in just a moment, some analysis of that debate. I don't know that it threw up a whole lot that was new. I just want to signpost before we go to Andrew Probert, though, that there are a couple of other outstanding things in this campaign that we do need to bring to you in this half hour between now and 2 o'clock Eastern Australian time. One is Bill Shorten media conference, which we've held over so that you could watch that Treasurer's debate in full. And we are hearing that Scott Morrison may choose to say something. We don't know when. Sort of hold a second announcement of the day, if you like. That's due sometime early this afternoon as well. If it happens in the next little while, we'll bring that to you. But why don't we go back to the Press Club and Andrew Probert, the Treasurer's debate. I suppose of all portfolio areas, there really hasn't been much movement in the central arguments from the day that this campaign was called through to today. These are pretty well rehearsed points of conflict or difference that we heard here today.
That's right, Greg. It's a bit like the leaders' debate, the first leaders' debate last week, where you had two men talking almost at cross purposes. Today, it was much the same. I mean, if there was one little news nugget for us all, it's that Chris Bowen said, he acknowledged that the budget needed bigger buffers. He said that interest rates are almost at emergency levels and that with inflation at zero, it's the time for bigger buffers. Now, we know that the Labor Party is going to be revealing its budget numbers on Thursday or Friday. That's a good week and a bit before the election. Now, it's actually longer than we've seen in previous elections, but Labor is not hiding from the fact that its economic agenda is so vastly different to the government's on tax, and tax was the central point of debate today between Chris Bowen and Josh Frydenberg.
Yeah, so these bigger buffers, bigger surpluses that he's promising to outline, Chris Bowen, on Thursday, as you say, with these costings being released. Do we take it that these are in the short term, what they call the forward estimates, the next 4 years, or actually aggregated out over the full 10-year period? Do we actually know what the answer to that is yet?
We don't know the answer to that, but you can imagine that whether it is the short or medium term, medium being the 10-year period, that Labor is going to pitch at having bigger numbers. But that is, of course, dependent on some of the savings getting through the Senate. And we already know with, say, franking credits, which was discussed at considerable length today, franking credits or retiree tax, if you want to use the coalition election lingo, is going to raise between $50 and $60 billion over 10 years. Now, if they can't get that through the Senate, then that's a lot of money that is going to be wiped from the Labor costings.
Yeah, so there's a bit to play out on the economy. There's those costings to be released on Thursday. There's an RBA board meeting tomorrow, which may give us some insight, I suppose, into the health, as the independent RBA would see it, of the economy. I suppose as you listen to both Josh Frydenberg and Chris Bowen, Andrew, you get the impression that difficult headwinds in a way suits each of their arguments.
Look, in some ways, but I suppose what today also exposed, and this has been a bit of a theme for the last 2.5 weeks, is that beyond certain economic parameters and economic promises, the tax cuts, the coalition hasn't actually got much. And Michael Rodden from The Australian asked this very question today. His first question after Sabra Lane, the host, he said, what is it in the coalition economic plan that you've got for us over the next 4 to 10 years beyond your tax cuts? Josh Frydenberg tellingly turned his answer into an analysis of Labor's tax agenda. Now, that just about tells you a lot about the way this election campaign is being fought.
Yep, it is. We're not going to prolong this analysis, Andrew, because we do have to bring our viewers the Bill Shorten media conference, but we will just observe in farewelling Andrew Probyn that there were also references to that celebrated Paul Keating interview that he conducted yesterday. That is still reverberating, and we heard both Chris Bowen and Josh Frydenberg tackle that security or security agency question that Andrew threw up yesterday. But we'll farewell him there from the Press Club and thank him. As we go to Bill Shorten, so he did speak as the Press Club debate was underway today between the Treasurer and the Shadow Treasurer. Bill Shorten out in Western Sydney in the seat of Lindsay, which Labor's trying to win with Diane Beamer as its candidate. So we'll bring you in replay all of Bill Shorten's media conference today.
Any questions?
Mr. Shorten, on your announcement today, $125 million in 6 years' time, which is half the capital cost of building this centre. I mean, it's a good thing for the area, but isn't there a critical need now in cancer units like this for additional funding? They're overrun, their demand is high, their ability to deal with the patient load is insufficient. Don't they need a funding injection within 6 years, like straight away?
Spot on, Mark. I think you've gone to the heart of this election in one question. That's why Labor's going to put back $14 million into the hospital here. That's immediate. What we're going to do with that $14 million is help make sure there are more nurses and more doctors. Because of Susan Templeman's lobbying, we're going to make sure that the emergency department at the Hawkesbury Hospital can take more people, which will lead to less pressure on the PN Hospital. That all happens straight away, but it doesn't just stop there. Elections are about choices. The government chooses to give billions of dollars right now to the top end of town, to welfare for the well-off. I choose to spend some of that money instead on providing scans and support for bulk billing for visits to the oncologist right now. Let's not forget that on Budget Reply Night, I outlined the most ambitious policy to start funding assistance for cancer treatment right now. There's a very clear choice. And Mark, your question, goes to the nub of it. There is a crisis now. Only Labor is prioritising putting money on the table to help with the out-of-pocket. So when the voters strip away all the ads and the negativity and all of the stuff that's going on, there's very simple choices. 1 in 2 Australians will get a diagnosis of cancer in their life. Out-of-pocket costs are expensive. To be honest, I was surprised when within 10 minutes the current Prime Minister sneered at our cancer proposal. He said it's all free if you go through the public system. No, it's not. We're talking to the survivors. It's not. But what's more is, and they said we couldn't afford it Always remember that politics is about choices. When Mr Morrison says he can't afford to help people in the fight of their lives now, or he can't afford to put back the money into Nepean Hospital, he's made a choice. He just didn't choose the patients. He chose instead to defend unsustainable and indefensible subsidies for the top end.
Mr Short. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating yesterday described the nation's spy chiefs as nutters. He said that they are setting the foreign policy for Australia and damaging our relationship with China. Do you share any of those concerns, and what would an incoming Labor government do in terms of those leading our security agencies?
Well, no, I don't share those concerns. Paul Keating's an elder statesman of Australian politics. He's never been shy of saying what he thinks. But for myself and for my opposition team, we've worked very well with the national security agencies. They know that and we know that. And we, of course, will continue to take the professional advice of the people who help keep Australians safe. Sorry, just hang
How
on.
do you ensure that the states spend this $500 million reducing hospital wait times? Will there be some sort of benchmark or target set?
Yeah, absolutely. What we'll do is that we'll put more money on the table to the states. And just to explain to people who are patients or waiting for elective surgery, what happens is that currently Canberra, the national government to whom the lion's share of taxes are paid, they're only paying 45% of the key hospital costs, whereas we think that Canberra, because of its significant, they're wealthier than the states, should help provide additional, so they should pay 50%. We'll sit down and do partnership arrangements with the states. A lot of our announcements are guided by the best advice of state experts right now.